All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining today. As I said before, please do feel free to turn on your video if you have questions to ask, or please do also feel free to type things in the chat, and we'll be sure to get to them. Quick note that we are recording today so that we can send this out to others in the future who might not be able to join us today. So just be aware of that as well, and make sure that you have that in mind as you're participating. My name is Eric. I'll be serving as the MC today. I'm an associate with the CHI team, and I'm really happy to be with you all, talking through a little bit about the Ending Rough Sleeping data framework and providing a little bit more detail on the new indicators that we have developed alongside some early adopter local authorities and the DLUHC team over the last months leading up to this point. So I'm going to first ask the folks who will be presenting today to introduce themselves, and I'll call them out one by one. And feel free, as others are already doing in the chat, to introduce yourselves as well if you're here participating. And we're looking forward to talking with you all. So I'm going to first throw it to Rob to introduce himself from the CHI.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rob Anderson, and I am Director for Knowledge Implementation at the Centre for Homelessness Impact. So for those who don't know us, we're the What Works Centre for Homelessness. We exist to promote a faster end to homelessness through the use of evidence and data, which is why it's been so exciting to work on this project over the last couple of years to improve the quality and utility of data on rough sleeping across the country. So looking forward to telling you all about it and chatting with you towards the end of the session.
Thanks, Rob. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Ben Melrose. I work in the rough sleeping policy team at DLUHC, and yeah, we've been working closely with the Centre for Homelessness Impact and all the early adopters on the data framework.
Thanks, Ben. John, you're next.
Hi everyone, I'm John Toman from Coventry, the rough sleeping manager here, and we were involved in the early adopter work.
Thanks, John. And last but not least, Joe, over to you.
Hi everyone, Joe Donoghue. So I work for Greater Manchester Combined Authority as the strategic lead for homelessness and migration, and we too were one of the early adopter areas supporting our 10 local authorities on development and implementation of the framework.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Well, we're really excited to have you all here and looking forward to talking with you about these new indicators that we've been developing. So the way that we're going to run today is we're going to have a very brief presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Rob to talk a little bit about the background of the framework and where we are today. I'm going to let Ben talk a little bit about how that fits into the DLUHC strategy and the other work that DLUHC has been doing around indicators, in particular for rough sleeping. And then Joe and John are going to talk a little bit about their experience as testing the indicators and rolling them out in their local authorities so far. So as I said, if you have questions, please do feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll make sure to address them. We also will have a Q&A section at the end. So if you have other questions that you'd like to ask, we can also address them at the end today. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and hand it over to Rob to take over the presentation in terms of the speaking part. And for the rest of the speakers, when you need me to go to the next slide, you just let me know and I will do that.
Thanks very much, Eric. Just going to wait for those slides to pop up. Do you reckon Chris Whitty had to do this at the start of the pandemic? Wait for the load up as well.
All right, Rob, should be there now. You're seeing it. Let me know.
Fantastic. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to start off today just with a very brief kind of recap of what the Ending Rough Sleeping data framework is, and also to talk in a bit of detail about the 3 new data indicators that we're going to be, DLUHC will be asking local authorities to submit as part of their monthly Delta returns from the end of June. Next slide, please. Okay, we've done agenda, so we'll skip past. All right, let's skip straight on to the next one. Fantastic. So hopefully a phrase which is becoming annoyingly familiar to everyone working in rough sleeping across England is the phrase ending rough sleeping means it is prevented wherever possible. Where it cannot be prevented, it is ensured that it is a rare, brief, and non-recurring experience. So This is the definition that underpins the government's current strategy released in 2022, was developed through work between the Centre for Homelessness Impact, ourselves, our work with some of the early adopter areas who we were working with actually back in 2021, and latterly the department, which came out of this question of what does ending rough sleeping actually mean in practice? There's been lots of goals over the years, and we've never quite made it happen. And part of the issue we learned from looking at the evidence of the last 30 years of rough sleeping policy in this country is no one's ever actually defined the goal or indeed put in place good enough data to understand whether we're getting closer or further away to it, and if things aren't working, why. So that was the impetus to establish what we call the qualitative definition of ending rough sleeping, which you can see in front of you. And the good thing about the definition is it gives you things you can measure. So it introduces 4 kind of areas of success or success pillars. Prevention, so looking at how effectively rough sleeping is being prevented in the first place in any given local area and nationally. The rare pillar, which is where previously we've sort of been focused for a very long time via the snapshot, like how many people are sleeping out on a given night or over a month. But also important about rare is it's a relative concept. You compare rare to, for example, say another nation or to another local authority or to 5 years ago. And that gives you a much more specific way of thinking about what your goal is when you're thinking about making something rare. Brevity, so this is about ensuring that experiences of rough sleeping are brief, and this is simply because we know that a longer a person experiences rough sleeping, the greater the harms to them that will cause. So we wanted to think about elevating that aspect of ending rough sleeping up to the same level as just ensuring numbers go down. So, say we imagine a world where there are fewer people rough sleeping, but those that do so for a very long time. Is that better than having more people who experience it more for a shorter period of time? No, we want it to be rare, brief, and non-recurring for everyone. And non-recurring, again, this is about recognizing that many people who sleep rough once may do so again in the past. It increases your risk, and that also increases the harms to the person. So the idea is that a full systems approach will address all 4 of these success pillars. Next slide, please. So you may remember last year, in around June, DLUHC announced that local authorities would be asked to basically provide data against the prevent, rare, brief, and non-recurring success areas for the first time. That was 5 new indicators. I'm going to introduce those on the next slide, but hopefully they should all be familiar to you. There was always an ambition that we would have 8 indicators, kind of 2 for each pillar. Try to keep it really tight, really focused. What's that minimum data set that every local authority should have? And we cut off 3 of them from our initial design because we thought they were going to be harder, and we really wanted to kind of kick the tires on whether they were the right ones and how to make them work in any local authority, not just ones with great data systems or lots of rough sleeping, but any. So today we're going to talk about those 3 indicators that we've been testing and the ones that are going to be coming out in the next month. Next slide, please. So this is the heart of the framework. These are what we call the core indicators. So the 5 that you can see that aren't highlighted should hopefully be familiar. Under prevent, the number of people who are new to sleeping rough, the number of people who are sleeping rough having left institutions. Rare, that very familiar flow number across the month. Brevity, the number of people experiencing long-term rough sleeping, and the number of people returning to rough sleeping. So in order to give us a more granular look into the rare, brief, and non-recurring pillars, we're introducing 3 new indicators. The one we call R2 under rare is the number of people sleeping rough who have moved into accommodation. Brief, we always had an ambition that we would actually try and introduce some measure of the duration of rough sleeping, not just a kind of cohort measure of the number of people experiencing a sort of a length. So say experiencing long-term rough sleeping, however that's defined, actually trying to get into the number of nights people are spending out. So that is what that indicator is intended to help us do. And finally, non-recurring, having already now collected data on the number of people returning to rough sleeping after a period of not being seen on the streets, we want to look into, okay, for those people who've been supported across the off the streets in the past, how many of those who have moved into accommodation are then returning later on, to give us that insight into how effectively our kind of move on pathways are working to prevent rough sleeping from happening again. I'm going to talk now about, in a bit more detail, about each of these. So basically, This indicator is actually fairly similar to data that's been submitted as part of the monthly Delta returns for quite a while now. It is about moves into accommodation, and it just tightens those up. There is, in the guidance that's been distributed, a list of what accommodation counts, and frankly, it counts most forms of accommodation you would typically use to support people who've slept rough, except for like specifically very short-term accommodations such as that provided under SWAP. I mean, SWAP is the main exception here because of the fact that is generally not considered to be a kind of attempt at a move on. It is an emergency response to severe weather conditions. But the data information about which accommodation types count is provided in the guidance. Next slide, please. So this is probably the most complex indicator, and there is going to be ample opportunity to ask questions about this one. So this is the number of nights people have been seen sleeping rough over a period of the last 180 days. So the rationale for this was we tried lots of different ways to try and conceive of how we would measure duration of rough sleeping. And we recognize there's a fundamental constraint to collecting data in this area is it is dependent on outreach. So there's always going to be variation on the basis of how much outreach an area is doing. And if you're trying to then extrapolate from that, like the true length of people's experience of rough sleeping, you get into all sorts of issues about the transparency of the data. So this felt like the most simple and straightforward, though limited way of looking at the number, basically people's typical experiences of sleeping rough. So what this indicator says is if you take everyone seen sleeping rough over the last 180 days, and then seen how many outreach contacts effectively, how many nights they were seen sleeping rough, and then which bucket do they fit into? Have they slept out for 1 night, 2 nights, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, more than 10, and so on? And what that should allow us to do is understand that kind of distribution of the frequency of people known to be sleeping rough. Obviously, it's not going to tell us everything. It's not going to be a universal measure of people's actual experiences because we don't have the structures in place to measure it. But it should tell us an awful lot about the kinds of experiences people are having, how that might affect their outcomes, but also a bit of insight how different kind of outreach approaches might be influencing both the number of people identified, but also the success of the interventions made to support them. Next slide, please. Finally, the new indicator under the non-recurring pillar, NR2, is taking your NR1 indicator, your returner indicator, so the number of people seen sleeping rough in the last month who had slept rough before, but has not been seen in the last 6 months. So basically you've seen a gap in contact for that person. Of those people, so you take that NR1 number, of those people, how many people were known to have moved into accommodation in your local area? We're not asking for this to be a global indicator of anywhere in the country because we understand there are limitations to people's ability to collect that data. This is supposed to be for your local authority. How many people who have returned to the streets have you previously moved into accommodation? And this should hopefully give you a bit of an indicator of where your accommodation pathway is working well, or where they could use some work. If you're seeing sort of an increase in people returning to the streets, that might tell you something about your accommodation provider network. And maybe there because something could be done there in order to improve that. So those are the indicators. There's going to be plenty of time to ask questions about those. I guess here's the list of accommodation types. Won't dwell on that one and move on to the next slide. Before I hand over to DLUHC to say there's lots of opportunity to ask questions and there's a lot of detail in the guidance that's been shared. Would encourage you to use the chat bar and use hands up to ask questions about those indicators.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. Yes, just for the next few slides, I'll just talk a bit more about some of the kind of wider context of this work and how it aligns with our other data collections, and then also some of the kind of additional sort of support offers that we're putting in place besides the drop-in session today. So yeah, thank you, Eric. So these new indicators, I mean, hopefully you're all sort of familiar with this, but they will go into the monthly rough sleeping survey, which is collected via Delta. And this rather busy slide just sets out the changes that we've made to the monthly survey when we updated it this spring. So as you can see on the left hand side, there are a number of indicators which we have removed. Now we thought it was really important that we did this because we're conscious of we really want to make sure that the indicators that we have in the survey are they're high quality and they're the right ones for us to focus on, and also conscious of sort of burdens on local authorities as well. So we did, as we always do, we did lots of engagement with local authorities, with colleagues in DLUHC, with the wider sector as well, to make sure we're only taking out indicators that we all agree with, and there's a few kind of amended questions as well, which I'll come on to. But essentially, the left-hand side there is a lot of the indicators which were in the monthly survey that have been there before the ending Rough Sleeping framework came into place. So anyway, you can see a number of them that we've removed, so we can really focus on the indicators around prevent, rare, brief, and non-recurrent. And then the only other thing to really mention is the middle and the right-hand column. It's just about a few changes we've made as well. And the main thing to say there is on the indicators around nationality and immigration, we've removed the combined cohort. So we're no longer collecting data on people off the street. So the immigration and nationality indicators will look a little bit different. So it's no longer a combined cohort. It's just like all the other indicators for people who are picked up via outreach. And then the second thing to say is, again, with the nationality and immigration questions, is we're moving, instead of collecting on a monthly basis, because sort of month to month the numbers or the percentages don't tend to change that much. We've moved to collecting that information every quarter. Again, with thinking about what's most useful, and also looking to reduce burdens on local authorities where possible. So we'll sort of collect it as a snapshot every quarter. So that means it will be collected 4 times a year, so for 4 months rather than every month. But we're not kind of collecting it. We're not collecting it sort of retrospectively for 3 months, if you see what I mean, because that wouldn't really reduce burden. So we're moving to sort of every quarter, every 1 in every 4 months, essentially. So that's just a few wider changes we've made. I think that's probably everything on that. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Eric. Thank you. Yeah, so this slide is just sort of setting out just the timeline over the next few months, and it's for those of you who remember the rollout of the phase 1 indicators, it's quite similar to what we did last year, but sort of broadly a year later. So as you can see, in May we're delivering the drop-in sessions. This is the 3rd one. The final one is tomorrow. Then from the 1st of June, that's when like outreach teams will be we need to be ready to kind of collect the new indicators, so over the month of June, that's when they will sort of be rolled out. And then you can see the Delta survey will open at the end of June on the 28th, and it will close on July the 14th, kind of in line with the usual processes for the Delta survey, usual timelines. And then the other things to highlight then are from sort of September, as we have done before, then we will share the new data with you via the Data for Insights tool, and then probably sort of November, December time, that's when we will be looking to publish the indicators. But that's sort of estimate for now. So that's what's coming up. The other thing to say, which is was in that June box, was just about more support offers in place. But thank you, Eric. Then next slide is great. So I also mentioned, as well as the wider context, there's a number of things that we are doing just to help local authorities and outreach teams sort of familiarize themselves with the new indicators. I won't go through every thing on that slide, but so drop-in sessions as per today, then we're updating the guidance which goes out every month on Delta. So there's just as the usual processes there. We've also got the implementation guide, which was circulated to local authorities about a month ago, which sets out a lot of the things that we've been talking about today in terms of like the aims of the new indicators, what we're trying to achieve, how they sort of sit together. And then kind of some of the more sort of specific stuff on the definitions and so on. So if you definitely worth kind of having a look over that if you haven't seen it already. We will also put all of these different products in one place as well once we've rolled them all out. And then, yeah, the other things just to highlight as well. So data principles, that's something that the analyst team at DLUHC have been working on. So essentially that is just going to go into a bit more the detail about what local authorities and outreach teams should consider when kind of conducting outreach. It will cover sort of working with data suppliers and kind of what questions you may want to be thinking about working with other partners. It will include sort of looking at different software systems, and crucially, it will set out a sort of minimum standard for data collection. So our aim is not to say kind of all local authorities, need to kind of maximize the quality of their data. We recognize that there is, of course, like variation in terms of like capacity at local level, but what we want to do is kind of set out a bit of a minimum standard so we can kind of help areas to kind of there may be some bits missing to get them to that minimum standard, rather than kind of saying we're absolutely maximizing quality. And then, yeah, that's otherwise. I mean, we'll there's a rough sleeping data forum. We don't have one of those scheduled yet, but we are keen to kind of keep that series going so we can keep a bit of a feedback loop with local authorities on rough sleeping data collection. We are going to look at having our analyst team sort of accompany some of our advisors to local authority visits as well. And yeah, that's probably everything there. We'll keep sort of refining our dashboards as well, and any feedback or questions you have, please do send them to the HRS data inbox, which you can see at the bottom there. I'm trying to think if there's and so there's one more thing I forgot to mention, is that we will look at rolling out a bit of an Excel template as well, just to give an example of how one of the early adopters has been collecting the data, so you can see what a system looks like. I think that, so yeah, lots of different bits. We'll make sure they're kind of all in one place as well. And yeah, any questions on that, do let me know via the inbox.
Thank you, Ben. And Rob, of course, as well, for the background on the indicators. I stopped sharing, as you all can tell. I'm gonna hand it over to John and Joe to talk a little bit about their experience as early adopters, developing and testing the new indicators and what it looked like from their perspective on the ground in local areas. So John, I'll hand it over to you first, and then Joe to wrap up.
There you go. Sorry, I'm not used to Zoom. Okay, so yeah, so like Joe, we were one of a few areas. We've been testing this for a few months now as a separate, shorter report. So a little bit of context: Coventry is a sort of medium-sized area. We don't have a data team, so I've been doing this in isolation with quite an unsophisticated system, which is basically, like many of you probably have, is a simple Excel sheet. And probably like you, over the years and months of it, I tweaked it to make it work for Delta, so it matches exactly what Delta asks. So I was just going to go over really the experience of what it's been like doing it, more than how we've used it particularly. So certainly there's the stats. One of the stats show up as percentages on one of these things, and that's been particularly useful for us, because we do get asked by councillors and stakeholders quite often for quick snapshots of who, what was it like for this particular period. You get freedom of information, so it's been particularly useful to see it as percentages rather than just like lists of numbers. So that bit particularly was helpful. It's helped us get partners on board a little bit more as well, because we can show a bit more detail around some of the areas. The hardest bit really was getting staff to focus on gathering the data. So the one about people moving into accommodation, staff are very focused on moving them in, but don't particularly always capture it. So it's just an ongoing nag, really, of making sure that you capture things as you go along. And really, it sounds so obvious, and it's stupid to say, but it is really all in the planning. These new, like all of Delta, if you know what you're looking for and you capture it as you go along, it's so easy at the end. There are some months when the staff aren't on it, and I do have to do a massive big data search. So it's all in the planning. So just briefly on the particular indicators then. So the people sleeping rough who've moved into new accommodation. Now this is all really, we're kind of used to this with Delta anyway, so that wasn't particularly onerous to do at all. I mean, we do have access to, being part of the council, we can access the local housing options data. And if you do have that, that is really helpful. So if you're not sure, you can check. I know not everyone will have that, but just as an aside, you know, we do. 1 second, I've lost my thing. The second one, the numbers of nights rough sleeping, we had a really big debate about this, because this was the one that probably is the more onerous for us, because we can't really just press a button and capture who's been out in the last 180 days. But we did feel that actually just capturing it for a month was only so helpful so far. So we thought it was worth a bit of extra work in doing it 180 days, which is in effect 6 months. So just to tell you what my simple spreadsheet looks like, we have a simple formula. So, you know, obviously we'll have the people's names on one side, and then I have a simple formula which captures the numbers of exits. So at the end of each month, I can quickly see how many times people have been out. And what I do now is I just have a separate tab with January, February, March, April, and I'll just write that number in, or not found. So I can quickly then see over the last 6 months. And when it first came, I did think, oh, that is going to be masses of work, but actually it isn't if you just capture it as you go along. And then all you have to do, if you have new people each month, just add them to that long list. So if anybody doesn't quite understand what I'm talking about, I'm happy for you to email me, but it is actually far more simple than I did think. And then the last one, people have been previously settled in a settled accommodation and returned to rough sleeping. I think if you're part of an outreach team yourself, you will kind of know that, because I will just see the name and I know they've been out before, and it's quite easy to find that. I guess if you are capturing data for a team that you don't manage, it may be more difficult because you're relying on them. But for me personally, that wasn't particularly difficult at all. So the biggest one was the middle one, which again wasn't too onerous at all. So overall, I would say it hasn't been an awful lot of work at all, and I'm doing it on my own really. So that's my 2 cents.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Appreciate that. And yes, as John said, you know, we can also get, in addition to slides, we can get John's email address out to folks if you're interested in following up with him as well. And so, Joe, I'll hand it over to you to talk a little bit about Greater Manchester and what you all have been working on as well.
Yeah, no problem. And as John highlighted, I guess the pinch of salt to take our contribution with is the fact that as a combined authority, we're lucky that in supporting our 10 local authorities that we have a bit more research and data capacity to throw behind this, which is immensely helpful, and appreciate that other local authorities might not be in the same space. Saying that, the work we've done with our individual local authorities has given us this overriding sense that implementation was way easier than we thought it was going to be across all 10 of our boroughs, particularly having done quite a lot of the groundwork in really thinking about those phase 1 indicators and do some of the prep work in terms of systems and practices and preparing outreach teams for implementation of the phase 2 indicators. Saying that, I think the nature of the phase 2 indicators require a little bit more thought from local authorities about what that's going to mean in practice. And for us, I suppose the first thing we had to get over was the idea that we can get to an absolutely perfect data set on this on day one. It's definitely the aim, but it's just going to take a bit of time. And I guess part of getting over that is realizing that the current means of tracking long-term and recurrent rough sleeping is so limited in what it tells us pre-data rough sleeping data framework, that actually the small improvements that we are going to make over time in understanding how we capture that experience and who we catch on individual outreach shifts will make a big difference. So trying to maintain that sense of this is new, it's going to be a bit complicated, but it will be beneficial in the long run, and the perfect doesn't have to be the enemy of the good, was really crucial in getting buy-in there. And I think the time frame, particularly on the phase 2 indicators, is really really useful. And the experience we've had in the early analysis of this is We still don't feel 100% confident on the outputs of those more complex recurrent and long-term rough sleeping indicators, but we know that as teams get used to inputting this in the right way, and we've got a consistent way of recording things, and that we'll get more confident with it over time. You've just got to hold that anxiety about, if it tells you something weird the first time you analyze this, to wait until we've got a few more quarters of data in to get to the truth. I suppose as a combined authority area, we had a range of different local authorities that I'll crudely split into two categories, I suppose, with two distinct challenges in implementing the framework. The first is in your areas of high volume, where you've got inner city areas that are dealing with a lot of people, working with quite big and complicated case management systems. And the challenge there was one in recognizing that slightly bigger outreach resource, that it's really important that we consider the practicalities of how this data is going to be collected, but also given the complexity of those teams and the systems that support them, that it's really important that as we move towards implementing these and shifting our systems, that we do it once and we do it right. What was interesting about the phase 2 indicators in these kind of high traffic areas, if you like, is we as early adopters had the opportunity to test a few different metrics of long-term and repeat rough sleeping to understand if there was one perfect metric that might capture that experience more effectively than another. But actually we found we were basically capturing the same number of people in that sort of target priority group, if you like, across a number of different metrics, and that actually the definitions that we landed on felt pretty appropriate, and that there's no one perfect way to do this, but we feel like we've got a level of confidence that over time, as our teams get a little bit more used to collecting data in this way, then we'll get a much better picture and be able to demonstrate the extent of long-term and repeat rough sleeping over time. The second category of local authorities we were working with, probably on the other side of the spectrum, i.e. Suburban or slightly more rural areas where you don't have an enormous amount of rough sleeping, but with that comes a diminished level of resource, and as John described, teams that are rushed off their feet constantly and there isn't a data analyst embedded within the rough sleeping function who can help you out with some of this. And so that came with some capacity challenges, but also as we dug into the weeds of it, we realized that in areas of low volume where you basically know people on the streets by name, the adaptations you need aren't that great, and often it's just a case of adapting a spreadsheet, and John's is a great one, and I know colleagues in Newcastle are doing some great work there, that we don't have to create an industry around this and make people go down a route of adopting a consistent case management system for what is a relatively volumetrically low problem. So we realized we could work within the existing spreadsheets that worked for teams, and that was basically fine. One of the things we did do to try and bridge the gap between those two categories of areas is to understand how we can, where possible, make that data collection easier for those less well-resourced areas. So one of the things we looked at was adopting a consistent module within case management systems that were already being used for housing options services, and attaching a bespoke rough sleeping module to that, so that we could at least have a level of confidence that every area within the combined authority was capturing data and reporting on it in a consistent way. But that wasn't the driving factor. The driving factor was, can we implement something that's a little bit easier and doesn't make things more complicated than they need to be? I think in selling this, one of the things that has always been at the forefront of our mind was constantly thinking about, if we're going to do this and we're going to do it well, how are we going to use that data? There's a rich level of insight that's been sat on Delta for many years that's not really been exploited to its full potential. And we're constantly thinking about, well, if we're gonna get our teams to work in this way and make significant changes to their MO, what's the benefit? So we're trying to look at how we can embed that in service reviews and understand how we can tweak our specifications for off the streets accommodation, which we're working through at the moment. But on top of that, it's also been tremendously useful for us, I think, for our individual local authorities on briefing political leads and also in lobbying efforts, in understanding that if we do a bit of this work up front, we've got a much richer picture of what rough sleeping looks like. And as John said, when you get those really quick, short, snappy requests for information, usually at 3 p.m. on a Friday, not only can we give people an understanding of the current state of play, but we can also give people an understanding of the nature rather than just the scale of rough sleeping. I think one thing that's been really useful that John alluded to is benchmarking. And I think one of the tricky things to sell here is that where benchmarking is at its best, it is looking at where things are going well for your area and how you compare to the national picture and to comparable areas. Not about setting up this KPI culture. We need to be better than the national average or whatever. We are where we are, and for us, the granularity that's come with the framework has enabled us to understand where things are going well and to try and do more of that. So, for instance, one of the metrics we realized in the prevention indicators around people leaving institutions pointed towards really good comparative outcomes for people leaving prison. If you're doing something well, it's really important that you understand why it's going well. And so that's led to some really fruitful conversations with probation colleagues and other people within the criminal justice system. So if we start from the point of view of this is about understanding what we're good at and building on it, then that the benefits of benchmarking really come to the fore. And I think, although it will be difficult to do this meaningfully on some of the phase 2 indicators for a while, it'll be really interesting to understand what's working in individual local authority areas and how you can replicate that and share what you're doing really well. So I think the success in that is really in selling the benefits of the framework, and to an extent it is a marketing job because you're asking people to do things differently, you're asking people to change their ways of working. But if you can start with what's the potential benefits are and what the implications could be for your immediate team in terms of better consistency of data, but also for the bigger picture and how that informs both local service development and your view of across the whole population of what you're doing right and perhaps where improvements could be made, then teams will buy into it. It takes a bit of work, but teams will go for it if you communicate the benefits well. I think that's probably enough for me, Eric.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And John as well. Thank you for your, talking a little bit about your experience as early adopters and testing these indicators and a little bit about how we're thinking about using them in the future. So we've got about 20 minutes left in our drop-in session today, all of which will be reserved for Q&A. So as a reminder for folks, please do feel free to put your questions in the chat. If you would like to ask a question, live, you can also do that. Just raise your hand. And if you would like to come on camera, please do so. There's 2 quick notes that I'll pull from the chat right now for folks. So one is just a question from Shirley about really not directed at us as a panel and more directed at other LAs who are here today. If anyone is using the RISE platform to work with their Delta data, and I think that there probably could be some further conversation around that, either in the chat here or offline. So encourage you all to put that information there or follow up with Shirley or with us at the end, and we can definitely make sure we cover some of that. The other question from Kylie was about how using in particular the B2 indicator, which is about the length of time, it really is affected by outreach. So I'm going to throw this one over to Rob, at least to start off with, but I know that everyone in the panel will have, I'm sure, a view on how this data, the B2 data, can be used despite the varying practices of outreach that we know are happening, across different local authorities. So Rob, I'll give it to you first, and then let others chime in.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that we went back and forth on quite a lot for our testing, and we tried to explore different ways that we might be able to kind of how could we, in a consistent and comparable manner, because that's the most important thing about this data set, the whole point, it was something that could be used in every local authority, not just, say, London authorities who have a chain-like system or something like that, was how we could do this in a way that would give us that insight into basically the number of nights people were actually spending out or were sleeping rough, without having to have like a kind of panopticon style, very, very complex system of measurement. And this was the best we could come up with. And like, you make a fair point, but basically this will be heavily influenced by the intensity of outreach in areas. So there's two ways in which that can be caveated and understood. One is that the primary use of the data is to understand your own local authority, which is to, as Joe was talking about, to be reflecting on what does your data say over the last year? What does the data say over the last couple of months? What's changing? What's not? You know, and be able to, for example, like really be able to track on a single sort of deck of indicators, almost on a single core scorecard, most of what should be changing as a result of the programs you're running. So say, for example, you should be able to see the effect of any changes that you do. For example, say you introduce a new way of engaging people who are new to sleeping rough. Ideally, you should both see your people who are new to sleeping rough go down, but you should also see your number of contacts go down as well, presumably, if that sort of like no night out or first night out approach is going well. And you should be able to build those insights out. So ideally, it's about learning what your own outreach capability is doing for you, basically. And the other is in terms of how it compares to other people. I mean, what this should hopefully be doing is informing conversations, for example, with your RSI advisors, who will have that context. You know, it's not going to be oh, your outreach contacts are low, that's a problem. It will be, okay, let's think about what that tells us about your outreach frequency and intensity, and what that's doing for basically your overall rough sleeping numbers. And also there'll be that opportunity, ideally, to be compared to nearest neighbors. There will be local authorities who have a similar outreach intensity to you, and there will be opportunity for that learning. And ideally, as this data set starts being collected and we learn from the data and we learn from the practice, which is going to be continued. For example, you know, DLUHC data group is going to be a great forum to be able to discuss these things. We'll be able to build out that nuanced picture. All that is meant to say, like, there is an understanding of the limitations of the indicator. There are ways to address it, but that's the main thing, is it's understood as a limited indicator. In the same way that when we talk about the rough sleeping snapshot, how many times have we all had to say, the snapshot doesn't tell us every single person who's sleeping out ever. It tells us how many people were there on a single night. It tells us trend over time. In the same way, we will have to communicate the locations. Is there a reason why outreach frequency isn't being collected? Simply because we have taken a principle of being as minimal as possible with data collection. You know, we try and limit the number of us that go out centrally to local government. You guys, everyone's busy, everyone's doing stuff. This is always supposed to be the core minimum data set, but it is certainly something that could be part of discussions, for example, with RSI advisors, or indeed with any other partners you're working with on the data set. I wonder if either John or Joe had anything to add on this one.
Just to reiterate, I never really think about other areas. The data for me is useful locally, and what we can, how we can use it. I don't worry about, you know, how we compare. I mean, I know that we are looking at that, but I think that will just, I'll get into a KPI kind of thinking, like Joe was saying. So it's never really, I don't over concern myself, but I haven't really thought about it that much.
Yeah, for us, I guess it's about how you use the indicators together, right? So one of the things that we've been really deliberate about through this work is trying to shift conversations on rough sleeping almost away from the single night count locally and towards the monthly data anyway, even when we're thinking about those rare indicators, because you'd expect that over the course of the month you're going to get a slightly more accurate picture of the volumes, aren't you? So I suppose we're considering the indicators around contacts and why that's useful. We probably try and contextualize that with, by the way, if you look at Bolton's outreach figures over the course of a month, and you compare that to the figure that we've got for contacts over that same month, you can start to see, by using those two data sets in concert, you can almost get a good idea of how intensively outreach is in that given area versus another area. So I think you can get a flavour of that, but it's, as Rob said, it's what you combine it with and how you explain that, and yeah, that can help you get to that level of insight if you so require. But I think it's as Rob said, it's about simplicity.
Thanks, Joe, and John, for that context as well. So there was a question from Charlie, also in the chat, about data being pre-populated with chain data. That is something, Rob, potentially that we can follow up with the Greater London team to figure that out. I believe the answer is yes to that, but I don't want to say definitively without checking. So Charlie, let us know. We can follow up with that as a note to do for us. So any other thoughts or questions, please do feel free to pop them in the chat, or come on video and ask your question live if you so choose. Excellent. Well, so my teacher training says 7 seconds, so we went more than 7 seconds with no questions. Any other final thoughts from panelists? Anything that you'd like to kind of leave as your last word for the session today? Feel free.
Go around in order we've been speaking. I'm happy to go first. The other thing that I think is really exciting about this this project is, of course, the fact that the framework data is now published quarterly, and that shouldn't be something to worry about. It's something to learn from. So the dashboards that you can find on the kind of .gov.uk website will allow you to see the framework data for any local authority in the country. And I know that DLUHC colleagues are working on ways to make that, like, basically to give local authorities access to not only their own data dashboards, which you already do, but potentially for there to be permission so that you could see other local authorities' data on a month-to-month basis. So that I just think is a really exciting opportunity to be able to kind of like learn, contextualize your own rough sleeping experiences. You have that conversation in a conference where someone says, oh yeah, we had that kind of issue and this is what we did. Being able to kind of contextualize that with data where you also know that you are comparing pretty much the same statistics using the same methodology, and that should enable you to learn, because that's the real benefit of this framework, we believe.
Thanks, Rob. Ben, go ahead if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, and just to add, we're rolling out the phase 2 indicators. I think this has largely been covered before. It will take a bit of getting used to. I know early adopters, when they've been testing them, it does take time to familiarize yourself with it, and that's why we had quite an extensive testing period. But I'm really proud of all of the work that has been done, and can really confidently say that the indicators we're sharing today have been sort of extensively tested by the early adopters with the help of CHI, and we have gone through various iterations as well, and we've really challenged ourselves on different options for some of these. So just to say, it's give yourself time to kind of get used to these, but we are really confident in the work we've done, but also we really welcome please do send any questions you have to the DLUHC inbox that we shared earlier, and we're very happy to kind of pick those up, and also we've got lots of support offer in place as well, so we will be sharing that with you.
Thank you, Ben. John and Joe, last words.
Go on, John.
Okay, well, it is just, I suppose it's a bit of what all three of you have just said, is that it is a work in progress, that, not to worry too much about it. It does tell you something locally, but I don't think anybody is going to be scrutinizing it nationally and being critical of it. It just is a tool to, and I'm in Coventry. I've been doing this pretty much in isolation, as I'm sure some of you have. And it's quite hard to get people interested in the data, but we have got a data guy now attached to housing, not in our team. And we are only really now just starting to think, how can we properly use this? Because when I just look at it myself, it just bounces around my head. I need to discuss it with someone and say, what am I seeing here? So I know it's a different experience in larger areas, I guess, where you can do more of that. But I think even if you're on your own, try and hook up with other people in other areas just to think, how can we use this? Because it's useful information, and it is so easy to just get bogged down with day to day doing the work because it is busy. So yeah, I suppose the message is not to worry about it too much. We're all doing the best we can, aren't we? And it's all a work in progress.
Yeah, thanks, John. Joe, go ahead.
John should have ended. That would have been such a wonderful note to end on. I guess I'll end on an example of how this has been incredibly useful for our local authorities. So over the last 9 months or so, we experienced, as many local authorities are seeing now, a really extreme increase in refugee rough sleeping across a number of our different areas. But it felt like we were going mad, particularly in the early days, because it seemed like this was not yet appearing in other local authorities of comparable size. And I think if we'd had to prove that was the case quantitatively by going through the sort of minestrone soup that Delta can be at times, it would have taken a long time, and it would have led to a very confusing picture. What the framework allowed us to do was say really clearly and definitively, with a small number of indicators, that our teams aren't going mad. There has been a 13-fold increase in the number of people coming through the P1 indicator through the asylum system over that period, and we can definitively prove that. And we can also, by using local demographic data, understand what are the nationalities, who are we seeing, how do we need to commission emergency support as effectively as possible, are there particular voluntary sector organisations that we can get in quickly to try and provide decent and sustainable housing advice for people. And I think that having done the work on this and being confident in the indicators allowed us to get that clear messaging across to everybody who needed it clearly, very concisely and effectively. So I guess I would end on by stressing that the opportunities for using this well are boundless. And if you start from a point of view of how is this going to help me in my area, then you'll very easily get the buy-in of the teams that are going to have to do the hard work of making those changes.
Great. Well, thank you, Joe, and thanks everyone, John, Ben, and Rob as well for joining us and kind of talking a little bit about the experience. I appreciate all of you who posted questions and who participated as well. As we said, if you have further follow-ups, you can reach out to the data inbox, as Ben noted, but also the CHI team is happy to answer questions as you have them, and we can always connect you again to our local authority partners like Joe and John and others that we work with to help you as well. So thank you all for joining. We'll let you go 5 minutes early today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a nice rest of your day. Thank you all.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.